China hosts the 14th BRICS Summit online this year as emerging markets and developing countries are coping with an increasingly volatile world. Can BRICS advance its role as a leading force for global governance reform? How can it promote global economic recovery during a worldwide pandemic and a war in Europe? And what can we expect from BRICS Plus in the future? Now, on a special dialogue panel discussion.
Hello and welcome to Dialogue. Global leaders from Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa gathered online for this year's BRICS Summit, which was hosted by Chinese President Xi Jinping. How can the five countries help promote world economic recovery? How can they continue to inject impetus into struggling economies in developing nations? And how can they better coordinate on a multilateral scale to build and expand cooperation? To discuss these issues and more, I'm joined with Atul Dalakoti, Executive Director at the Federation of Indian Chambers of Commerce and Industry and Center founder of a BRICS Center for Economic, Cultural Research and Services, Professor John Gong at the University of International Business and Economics, and Mark Sloboda, a Moscow-based international affairs and security analyst. That's our topic. I'm Xu Qinduo. Well, Atul, what has the bloc achieved so far economically, or what has each of the members benefited from being inside this group?
I personally feel that the achievements of the BRICS cooperation have been quite impressive. China's trade with Brazil, Russia, India, and South Africa has practically doubled between 2016 and 2021. To $490.4 billion US. From India's perspective, we have reached a bilateral trade of $125.7 billion US in 2021. Of course, there are issues of trade deficit, which we need to work with the Chinese counterparts. Otherwise, trade growth is not going to be sustainable. I'm sure in the next few years, the sort of momentum we are looking at, bilateral trade would cross $200 billion between India and China. Again, from a BRICS new development bank perspective, I think it has already given out $30 billion US to 80 projects in member countries, which again is quite a good start for this institution. And with new countries joining, I'm sure NBD is going to play a much bigger role in the future, because just trading is not enough. We have to invest in each other's economies to create a common ground where all our economic interests can converge.
Mm-hmm. Well, Mark, what does the grouping mean to Moscow? Particularly, we are seeing the decoupling between Russia and the West.
Yeah, I think BRICS is for Russia's both their economy and their, shall we say, geopolitical standing. BRICS is perhaps more important than ever. The economic, political, social decoupling that Russia is experiencing now with the West. For the first part, I think it was inevitable. It was always going to happen. And I think Russia is not the last country that will suffer it. I think we are unfortunately being pushed a few decades after emerging from a bipolar world system, briefly into a unipolar world system, and trying to hang on to that at all costs is pushing us, unfortunately, not into a multipolar world system, but back into a bipolar world system. And Russia is far from the only country to experience this heavy-handed unilateral sanctions and economic warfare, although it's certainly experiencing it now more than any country has before. BRICS provides parallel institutions. It is in the nascent days. Let's be honest about that. But there is a lot of potential there. BRICS has made modest achievements at facilitating bilateral trade between its members that can be directly attributed to increased trade between them. But once again, as previous speakers have already said very well, the new development bank is the most significant institutional achievement of BRICS so far, and it is just in its early days. There is a lot of potential for it, and for institutions to be built, other institutions to be built around it. And there needs to be a parallel world financial and economic infrastructure system outside of the hands of countries that have shown a willingness to weaponize it with devastating effect to exert their geopolitical influence in other countries. And the Chinese president, just in the days in context with the BRICS summit this year, spoke against hegemonism, against hegemony, against this unilateral use of power in all different spheres, economic included, to exert, if not complete global control, then certainly something that is working in that direction. And Russia sees in BRICS the kernel of something that could create a parallel system to that. And right now, Russia's continued trade with all of the BRICS members is a very hopeful sign in that direction.
Mm-hmm. We'll come back to that to see, like a mechanism construction. If there's what's the potential, what can they do to be more independent of any potential sanctions, probably from other countries for this grouping. So Artur, if you take a look at the current status of the BRICS grouping here, they account for 42% of the world's population. Indeed, a big grouping. They contributed to like a 50% of the global growth. They're representing basically 24% of global GDP. Some say, for the global economic recovery, if the BRICS countries, the big economies, if they can take good care of their economies, and then that's a great contribution to global economic recovery. Is that the case?
I strongly feel that the engines of growth are in the BRICS countries. And we would see the percentage of the world trade grow between these countries, and also the percentage of world GDP. It's high, but it can go much higher. With 42% of the people living in these countries, any economic growth will undoubtedly affect the whole world. So if we can grow, at least half the world can grow with us, There is now hyperinflation in many Western countries. It is imperative that we need to trade more among the BRICS countries and look at areas of synergy where we can complement each other. Mutual investments in areas of win-win cooperation should be identified to create cross-border initiatives in the new economy area. New economy is one area which I feel very strongly about. The future is in the new economy area, and it's dynamic, it's cross-border, and it's very quick. Countries like Russia, China, India, Brazil, South Africa can really work together. If one idea, new idea which works, which is disruptive, which works in India, it can be taken to these BRICS countries. So we can create a platform in BRICS for this. So I think the real engines of growth are with the BRICS countries, even though the BRICS countries have not, for certain reasons, not been able to come up to the expectations of the economists in the past. But I feel that with the changing scenario in the world today, things will look up for BRICS countries.
Mm-hmm. Mark, picking up on what you have said earlier, this year's meeting also touched upon the use of national currencies of BRICS members and the creation of an independent BRICS rating agency. Had there been any breakthroughs on this issue? Could such a mechanism becomes like a new financial system, at least for developing countries?
Yeah, I think this is still a work in development. I mean, I don't believe that there are any announcements expected out of this BRICS summit that, we have a common new global rating agency. It's not going to pop up overnight, but the work is being laid. I think we're now seeing an acceleration, an understanding of the need for it, and I believe that demand will mean that it will be met in the near future. I think the BRICS countries all individually have a lot on their plate to deal individually with the repercussions of this global economic crisis coming on the heels of the pandemic crisis that is going to absorb a lot of focus and resources right at the moment. But the foundations are laid for these things. They're simply take time to implement. And in particular, a global ratings agency that is truly independent and more objective than our existing ones. It's really wrong to say ours because it's really theirs. And they have unfortunately been highly politicized. Is another moment for BRICS to shine in the creation of this parallel architectural system. The potential for BRICS expansion, there are positives and negatives for this. In geopolitical terms, I would say it's a negative. We have seen, I think, with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which a number of the BRICS members are also members of, that it has become much harder to reach consensus. And political problems between its various members have been brought into the organization, and they have resulted in, I would say, a bit of stagnation in the direction of the organization. BRICS, but in geoeconomic terms, this broadening of BRICS to countries such as Argentina, Saudi Arabia, a lot of potential there for the goal of creating alternative economic architecture. With an economy of the size and importance of Saudi Arabia, with abundant energy resources and the political power that they wield in the Gulf, indicating that they are interested in joining BRICS. Suddenly, the whole project assumes a much greater possibility of success.
Let's have a break. We'll be back right after this. Tell us how necessary it is probably for the grouping to have their own rating agency and to build a exchange system using their own currencies instead of relying on the US dollar, for example.
I think it's very important that we look at the present scenario across the world, and payment system becomes very important. I think everything is moving towards a digital currency. So that itself is going to bring new opportunities in how we can create a financial system of payment terms and everything, which is away from the traditional system, which because of the sanctions has become so very difficult to navigate. So from that point of view, I think it is very important that we create a financial system or a banking system where there is trade in local currency between countries to make it much more simpler. For the rating part, I think, as Mark has suggested, that it's not so simple to do it. It's going to take time, but I think now is the time to start on these things, on these initiatives, to be able to create a new system, which is not being influenced by one big power or the other, but is more towards the trading blocks of BRICS who are trading together. And when we are talking at $490 billion of trade between these countries and China, you can imagine how huge this whole potential is. So we do need rating systems, because when we need to create more synergies between companies, we need a good rating system. We need good rating systems for more investments between these countries. So for an economic alignment of the BRICS countries, we do need a good rating system for which we should start now. It would take some time, but it is a good initiative, according to me.
Mm-hmm. Well, John, speaker for the rating agency, I still remember, back in 2008 and 2009, the Europeans were pissed off because of the ratings given by rating agency from the U.S. They are not happy with that. They saw the necessity of having their own rating agency. Obviously, it works here for the BRICS countries too. I mean, of course, exchange use or reliance on their own local currency is also very important in terms of sanctions, pressures from the U.S. or from other countries. For example, even India, despite this, I would say, rather strong relationship with the U.S., because of their purchase of S-400 system from Russia, they are faced the threat of being sanctioned. Not to mention Russia, China, right?
First of all, the ratings agencies. I think if these agencies in the United States really have never been engaged in sort of being used this in a critical way, they wouldn't have such an outcry for alternative systems. But now, everything changes. But I think also, it's a good idea. I think it's something definitely everybody's hoping for. But it also have to be realistic. I'm just trying to play the devil's advocate here. Ultimately, let's look at where the funds are raised. I think predominantly still it's going to be raised in New York, in London, these Western markets. So even though you can create your own rating agency, if the demand sides of these bonds are residing in these countries, in these markets, the demand for an alternative rating system would be quite questionable in my view. So I think it's a long shot. It takes a long time and takes a lot of effort. But I think one thing that's developing probably in our favor, and I'm not afraid of using the word our favor, is the fact that more and more of these financing and raising of fund activities are happening in the developing world. For example, these days, at least for offshore RMB bond market, the largest one is now it's actually in Hong Kong. So, I think there's no reason to use a firm on Wall Street to provide a rating service for bond issuance in Hong Kong, I guess. So I think we have to be realistic at the same time that this is going to be a long time, and the pace of this happening is going to be in accordance with the pace of more and more of these financial activities happening in the developing world. I think that's probably a more realistic description of what's going to happen in the future.
Well, if you look at this wider, the global situation, for example, globalization or anti-globalization, President Xi stressed, for some time, globalization has met some headwinds. Some countries attempted to decouple from or build small camps against others. The international society is very much concerned that if the trend continues, global economy will be divided into separate and isolated regional groupings. Those who try to go against the trend of history and prevent the rise of other countries will ultimately block their own development path. So basically, Mark, the idea is like, those efforts, yes, they will probably damage or hurt others, but probably they themselves will be hurt too. What can BRICS countries, as a collective group or individual BRICS countries do in such a hard, I would say, more challenging situation?
Yeah, I think what you mentioned with globalization is crucial to understanding what's going on right now. Globalization has suffered a body blow, and it does not mean that globalization is ending, but it is definitely going to take on new characteristics, and it is going to be fractured, splintered in ways that it hasn't been before. And we're seeing that physically in the form of large swaths of the world's airspace being denied, to other countries' civil traffic. We're seeing new barriers, new censorship going up on the global internet, becoming more fractured. I think we'll tell our grandkids about the golden age of the global internet, and we're going to see smaller, more focused blocks of that, and that is going to have repercussions for the economy as well. And I think we're seeing right now how the very short-sighted and hubristic use of these economic weapons, these unilateral sanctions, the blowback from them, from the West, is actually having, at least for the moment, much greater effects on their own economies and their own taxpayers than they're having on their intended target, Russia, in this situation. And that's simply a result of the peculiarity that it has devolved into a battle of commodities versus capital, or capital control. And in this case, if you attempt to sanction such a large provider of commodities that, from OPEC, to the World Food Programs have pointed out, you can't do without a large countries like Russia's provider of commodities. It disrupts. Someone else is going to purchase them. And the result is prices are pushed up and the Russian economy benefits. The Russian ruble is doing better now than it has, certainly before the intervention, but it's doing better now than it has in a decade. And that certainly is an unintended consequence. Meanwhile, European consumers are facing double-digit inflation, a return to burning coal in a desperate attempt to provide energy and warmth to heat their citizens, and for what? For geopolitical control, flipping, and this argument over security in the European space. I think the BRICS countries are all right now benefiting from this perversely. China and India are both gaining relative advantage to their own industries because they are getting discount priced energy from Russia in comparison to global market prices, while European economies, their companies are facing shutting down because of the lack of energy as they scramble to find new supplies. BRICS are going to come out of this, both individually and collectively, stronger. And we're seeing a huge economic and power transfer that is a direct blowback of this economic warfare, of this attempt to control the global economic system that is just seeing it slip out of their grasp as they attempt to tighten their fist.
Mm-hmm. Well, Artur, finally, obviously, for economies inside this BRICS grouping, developing countries, their priority is development. They would love more integration, more free trade, more investment, more globalization. But the current status quo is not satisfactory. So what is the future of globalization? What will be the effect on the BRICS countries?
I want to look at it from a different angle by saying that, the digital transformation is changing our lives. When technology is disruptive, it creates new opportunities for consumers. So disruptive technologies today are one of the key drivers of economic growth globally. For all the crisis, the best way forward for all these economies is to grow well. That's the best solution to it. Because today the polarization is such that if you start talking politics, it becomes very difficult to talk the economic reality. And that's why what we need to do is to maintain the engines of growth in our economies. India and China are going to be the second and third largest economies in the world. Russia is rich in natural resources. South Africa is the door for the African continent. And Brazil is equally important in Latin America. So why not put all these forces together, combine their resources, combine their opportunities to work together? And the future for all these countries is bright, provided we can work hard, look at the new industrial policies, look at the new economy, look at investing and trading with each other, and creating a block, I'm using the word block here, of good economic relationships, which are win-win in nature, which are based on mutual respect. And this is going to be a great driver for peace all over the world. So that's the way I see it.
Well, on that note, we come to the end of today's show. Many thanks to our guests. You can also find us on the CGTN app on YouTube. I'm Xu Qinduo. Thanks for being with us. See you next time.